Good afternoon and welcome to the 690th meeting of the Economic Club of New York. I'm Barbara Van Allen, President and CEO of the club. It's an honor to be here with all of you in our milestone year, 115th anniversary. The New York Economic Club is the nation's leading nonpartisan forum for discussions on economic, social, and political issues. And actually, over the last couple of years, through our diversity, equity, and inclusion program, we've been leveraging the club's platform to bring together prominent thought leaders to help us explore and better understand the various dimensions of inequity in underrepresented communities and highlight strategies, practices, and resources that the business community in particular can use to be a force for change. We're not doing this work alone. We'd like to give a special thanks to our corporate partners, BlackRock, Bloomberg, MasterCard, PayPal, S&P Global, and Takana Capital, as well as the many members, speakers, and subject matter experts that are now and will be engaged in this work. A special welcome to members of the ECNY 22 class of fellows. This is a select group of diverse, rising next-gen business thought leaders, as well as students from the Cooney Graduate Center, the NYU Stern School of Business, the Gabelli School of Business at Fordham, and Rutgers University, who are joining us today. As a reminder, we're now taking applications for the 2023 Fellows Program here in New York. We also just had the board approve in November a national digital Fellows Program. So for the first time, we'll have a class of fellows from around the country and probably some from around the world. Today, I'm honored to welcome our special guest, Sukhinder Singh Cassidy. Sukhinder is the CEO designate for Xero, and she will be taking up this role in February 23. She's an experienced CEO, digital leader, and board member with more than 25 years of experience building and scaling global companies, including Google, Amazon, Yodlee, Joyous, and StubHub. From 2018 to 2020, as president of StubHub, she was responsible for the platform's operations across the United States and international sites. She also served as a member of eBay's global executive leadership team. Sukhinder has deep international and fintech experience. She was the founder, chair, and CEO of Joyous from 2011 to 2017, from 2003 to 2009, president of Asia Pacific Latin America at Google, where she successfully built its operations from less than $100 million to a multi-billion-dollar business spanning 103 countries. Wow. Prior to Google, Sukhinder co-founded fintech pioneer Yodlee in 1999 and served as SVP of Sales and Business Development. A Canadian national, Sukhinder is strongly associated with technology companies throughout Silicon Valley. She started her career in investment banking with Merrill Lynch in New York and London. She currently serves on the board of publicly traded fintech Upstart. She also has previous experience serving on the boards of Ericsson, TripAdvisor, Urban Outfitters, Stitch Fix, and J.Crew. Sukhinder is an advocate for advancing diversity and inclusion. In 2015, she founded theBoardlist, an online talent marketplace connecting CEOs with qualified, diverse board candidates who are peer endorsed. She's also the author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, Choose Possibilities, which offers advice on how to manage and optimize risk-taking for professional growth. The format today is a conversation, and we're delighted to have Bloomberg's Deputy New York Bureau Chief and Senior Editor, Shartia Brantley, doing the honors of moderating. In addition, we're going to use the chat box for this conversation, and you can enter questions directly there for consideration, time permitting. As a reminder, this conversation is on the record, so we do have media on the line. Shartia, if you're ready, happy to pass the mic over to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Barbara. Appreciate the lovely introduction. I am honored to discuss advancing access and opportunities for diverse leaders with Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, incoming CEO of Xero. Welcome, Sukhinder.
Thank you so much. You look so bright and sunny from wherever you are. I sort of feel like I need to change my background. I'm like the color. I'm feeling like you're the burst of energy on this call. I'm super excited to be here.
Oh, thank you. I had to wear a little color. We have gloomy weather outside, so I'm trying to counter that. Well, we're just delighted to have you. Before we dive into our conversation, can you just give us a quick overview of Xero?
Sure. Xero is one of the leading global cloud-based small business accounting solutions, really giving small businesses around the world insight and opportunity. We serve millions of customers from Australia, New Zealand to the UK, Canada, the US, South Africa, across the globe, ASX listed. And I recently accepted the incoming CEO role, which I'll officially take over in a couple months.
Again, congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, I want to shift our conversation to talking about the state of business and diversity, equity, and inclusion. You have had such an esteemed career and wear many hats: CEO, entrepreneur, board member, and investor. How would you describe where we are in advancing access and opportunities for diverse leaders?
So I think if I had to describe it, I think we are at a macro level, we would say on a consistent upswing. But I think that, at least from my perspective as maybe a founder of theBoardlist, which is, I think, gave me a unique point of view, particularly on board diversity, but also as this obviously former CEO and hopefully one again soon. The way I think about it is there's spikes and troughs in sort of that upward trend. So if we can agree that sort of broadly speaking, the topic of ESG has come to the forefront for private and public companies in the last 10 years, and it's not going anywhere. Institutional investors are starting to ask the right questions about what is your company's, strategy with regard to all of its stakeholders, its customers, its employees, its shareholders, and the causes and issues they care about that can drive, sustainable, and I would say, socially just is not the right word. I would just say responsible citizenry as a corporation, right? What does that mean? On the other hand, and I described this to you in our prep call, when I say we go through peaks and troughs, if you think about the social justice movements we saw, George Floyd as an example, the Me Too movement, unfortunately, difficult social situations gave rise to actually increased demand and attention paid to issues of diversity and inclusion. By the way, the talent wars in the boom economy of tech also gave rise to people thinking about, wow, how do I capitalize on the human potential of all my employees, right? Employee activism, they've all given rise to, I would say, kind of spikes to the top side. On the other hand, you and I also discussed we are now in an uncertain economic environment. In tech, for example, we're in a contracting environment where budgets are going to get cut to the essentials. And, one of our worries is, gosh, what happens to diversity and inclusion budgets when, the CHRO is asked to slash their spending? And that's a fear. So I think that, we're going to see expansion and contraction, but I think this theme and trend, has been on the rise for the last 10 years, and it's not going anywhere for all of the reasons we described.
Mm-hmm. And with that being said, you have a seat at the table. How have the conversations then changed? Are you all having more honest conversations on the state of affairs and where we are?
Well, I think, and I'm obviously curious for your perspective on this because you have a point of view also as a journalist. So I would love to ask the same question to you. What I observe is, at the board level, not only the conversations happening, I think largely speaking, this has shifted from a conversation about why to how. So, nobody debates, quite frankly, the need for diverse perspectives in the public boardrooms, even in private boardrooms, where 75% of the Boardlist demand, which is a platform for discovering and recommending board talent, 75% of our demand is from private companies. And, the very first placement we did in 2016 was a Series A company. So I'd say even private company founders and CEOs are thinking about how do I run a better boardroom and what does diversity look like? So I would say the conversation has moved from, I think generally speaking, like, why would we do this to how do we do this? And I think that's generally a positive. It's the same thing, I think, inside of companies. If you look at, employee resource groups, if you look at, the role or the hiring of a diversity and inclusion officer in most CHRO kind of portfolios, there's a remit for it. So I don't think people sort of debate the why. As I said, what I'm more worried about does the how, how do we make sure the how, despite, economic uncertainty continues, because this is a need. So I think the conversations have shifted fundamentally from questioning the need to figuring out how to get it done.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned a myriad of factors earlier, inflation, companies are still dealing with supply chain woes. Are we entering a recession or not? So just so many things for senior executives to be mindful of. So when you think of all these issues leaders are facing today, and you spoke earlier about the various peaks and troughs along this journey, are we still in a moment, or do you see this as a sustained movement going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a sustained movement in the way that one describes, when I talk to people about business movements, I always say like, hey, you want to ride the tailwinds. Like there is a macro tailwind behind diversity and inclusion. That does not mean, in the short term, we don't need to be worried about things like contracting, CHRO budgets. But the point is, the conversation's not going away. It's not because we have a recession, we're going to sort of magically stop talking about diversity and inclusion. As you know, the cat is quite out of the bag here. I think the question is how to keep it top of mind and present at a time when executives are under a lot of pressure, right? And I mean, by the way, this is a conversation I used to have, even in the boom times, where you would say, hey, guess what? To create an environment and a workforce that reflects your customers, your employee base, all those things, you have to be intentional. It doesn't just happen. So if you have to be intentional in boom times, imagine how intentional you might need to be in times when there's all sorts of uncertainty you're facing. It doesn't, it's not that it's any harder, it's just you have to be mindful. And I would say this is a time to be even more mindful and protective of creating those environments, that are inclusive and that are diverse, regardless of all of the other challenges you face. So I think it's a question of mindfulness. And I appreciate that, depending on what sector you're in, you're facing a lot of uncertainty right now. But yeah, that's the job of an executive. Quite frankly, it's gotten harder every year. So is the job of a CEO. So this is, one more important thing to hold for your stakeholders.
Yeah, as
in your company's long-term performance.
Oh, definitely. And we spoke about this last evening, how just expectations of senior leadership have evolved, I would say, quite dramatically over the past 5 years or so, as some people may have maybe an absence of leadership, either from government or what have you, that leaders are expected to take a stand and speak up a little bit more. Than maybe 10 years ago or what have you.
Yeah. I mean, I think all the jobs have gotten harder. By the way, the job in the boardroom has gotten harder given all the uncertainty, disruption, and your expectation as a board to also not just be reactive, but to be honest, think about all the stakeholders beside the shareholder. A board is required to, obviously provide oversight governance on those matters too. Then you've got the CEO who, as we chatted about, is now not dealing with just commercial performance, but the management of multiple stakeholders. And as we said, I think the rise of employee activism, sort of the ongoing sort of balance for a CEO between what societal issues you get involved with versus not, versus just sort of running the business and putting your head down. People are going to ask you. So it's not, you simply can't just say like, I don't want to deal with it. It's coming your way. And as we said, the executive teams and the C-suites underneath them, right? So look, it's a time of more pressure and more performance. Because as we discussed just a little while ago, you have to manage a whole host of stakeholders in an environment of increasing uncertainty and pace of change, right? Whether it's a black swan moment like COVID, which my God, was unexpected, or the expected turbulence of the economy or other things, whether they're predictable or not, there's just the rate of change is so high.
Meeting the moment. I do want to talk about ESG and board diversity. As Barbara mentioned earlier, you launched the board list in 2015. Can you share with us what inspired you to launch this platform and what has been the reception and the overall mission of the platform?
Sure. So the board list, for those who don't know it, is a online tech platform. Think of it as a premium talent marketplace where diverse groups of all kinds can be recommended and found for board opportunities. And if you think about the genesis of it, the board list was born. Sometimes it feels like it was too early. Other times it feel like it was right on time. I don't know. We're 7 years in, and I feel like we barely scratched the surface on the board list. But the board list was born in 2015 of a frustration I had when I was then the CEO of my own startup. And one of my VCs reached out to, two things were happening. VCs that I knew that who were not investors in my company, were reaching out to me as a senior women leader and saying, what should we do to solve the problem of women in tech? And, I found that question I was getting asked it a lot. And on the other hand, my own board member, who is a prominent VC called Cable Desai, had 6 women in his portfolio who were CEOs. And he wrote us all a note. And he said, my God, every headline is so negative, yet I've had a wonderful experience watching all of you in my portfolio. It's not for me to speak on your behalf, but what's your opinion on all of this? And he sort of challenged us, like, does somebody want to use their voice to say something? And I think that confluence of him prompting us and me getting asked this question, I sort of said, you know what, I could just stay silent, but I do have an opinion on this. And the board list was a result of that, because I had sort of chatted with VCs, and one of the ideas or brainstorming ideas that had come up was, hey, look, if you wanted to change the prognosis for women in tech, I'm like, you're starting with trying to hire more women into engineering. That's great. That's fine. It will take many generations to solve. Yet I said, there's so many talented women in leadership positions in the Valley. Why don't you start top down? Why don't you as a collective say, we're going to put a woman on the board of every Series B company and beyond, and just watch the ripple effect of coming in from the top and trying to solve diversity. You don't need to wait. And a number of VCs said to me, oh, that's a great idea. And I was like, well, you guys should just do it. And they all came back and said, it's a really good idea. We're just going to worry about our own portfolio companies. And so I was like, okay, well, nobody's going to come together and solve this. And so I ended up writing an op-ed on the topic of women in tech. I surveyed a bunch of female founders, talked about their experience, so it didn't represent just mine. And at the end of it, I was like, look, if we can't use tech to solve our own problems of diversity and inclusion, yet we talk about solving world hunger, poverty, literacy at a global level, surely we should be applying tech in our own backyard. And so I basically came out of that and thought, you know what? No one's ever going to do anything with this idea. So I went to 30 well-known tech folks, and I said, if I crowdsourced a list, they were all like people like Reid Hoffman, and said, hey, I'm thinking of putting together on an Excel spreadsheet a crowdsourced list of highly endorsed women for boards, that we can solve this problem of where are all the great women? And those 30 people produced 600 names. We launched it at Fortune Brainstorm Tech as literally, when I say it was the barest of bare platforms, the idea came to fruition between June 15th and we launched at TechCrunch, I think, or at Fortune Brainstorm Tech, maybe July 30th or something like that. So 6 weeks, literally. And from there on, we built up the platform. Today, we're at 38,000 members, 22,000 recommended candidates, 14,000 people in our community who are what we call recommenders or experienced board directors and CEOs, who are that they're recommending or searching for their next board member. We've assisted over 2,400 companies in looking for their next board member, 75% private, 25% public, every stage of growth. But we think of ourselves as a discovery platform, meaning we're not a search firm. We literally are a place to go discover great talent. And we hope we make it really easy for you to build a board list yourself or with our assistants. We have both services.
Mm-hmm. And so you encourage executives to submit. So the process, how does one become a member of the board list, either from from a corporate perspective or to serve as a board member?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, let's talk about how we deal with people who want to be board members. Today, one of two things happens. It's a peer-nominated community. So you can apply to the board list and set up your profile, but then you have to effectively just enter 1 to 2 people. You just need one endorsement from somebody who has board experience. We generate an email out to that person. So you ask someone to endorse you. By the way, the person who endorses you does not need to be a member of the board list. They can become a member of our community simply through the act of endorsing you. So we say, if you want to be a board member, go out and bring your endorser. You know better than us who in your network has board experience, who can vouch for your capacity or capability or potential as a candidate. And then on the other side of it, if you know someone who's great, you could go to the board list today and just nominate them. So we started, of course, with the push of, or I would say the pull of people who know great people. And now it's flipped, right? 3/4 of our activity is from people who come, sign up, and then invite their endorsers. So that's how it works. If you're a company, or if you're a private equity firm, or if you're a talent firm, if you're a search firm, you can come to the board list and do one of two things. You can set up a free profile and do a quick search. There's some limitations on search because we're a freemium product. And then you either sign up for a subscription, which is really suitable for people who want to run the search themselves. Many people can, I'm your CEO of a Series A company. You might say like, hey, I want to just go take a look myself, generate a list. So you can pay a subscription and do it yourself, or you can do what's called assisted search, where we will put a talent partner with you and they will manage the process for you.
Wow. Now, can you confirm whether this list is just domestic or global?
Well, there's, I would say, I think you should think of it as very heavily US, given where our network is, but it is global in the sense that we have nominations from all over the world. The only other country we quote unquote officially launched in is Canada, where we went up, did an event, specifically sought out endorsers, right, who could jumpstart the network. So Canada, I think, is about 10% of the database, but we have nominations from all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And you can look all over the world. There's no restrictions on becoming a member from anywhere.
Got it. Now, can you share the gender breakout? Are you seeing more women, submit their information to the board list, or is it pretty even, or any trends that you're seeing, especially over the past couple of years in terms of demographics?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the demographics of the board list, but then maybe what we're seeing in terms of searches. So in terms of demographics, remember the board list was originally launched for gender equity. And it wasn't until George Floyd that we switched on, the opportunity for any diverse group, recognized diverse group to be a part of the board list. So we're probably 75% women, though obviously a very large, nice large cohort of people of color, both women and men. But keep in mind, part of the database has been growing for 7 years and part of it has been growing for 2 years. So necessarily we are pretty gender skewed. But of course, men are on the platform too. And as I said, different types of diversity are recognized on the platform. In terms of trends, what I would say is, so I'd say in terms of demographic trends, it's just a mix that's, blending up towards all types of diversity, but it's still heavily gender based today, just again, given our origin. In terms of the trends on searches, there's some things that are pretty steady, which are very, expected, but I think we're different than a search firm where maybe the remit you give is like, I want a sitting CEO on my board. Like the lens has widened. So at the board list, yes, people want sitting CEOs, but honestly, they're there because they're intentional about their board composition. So mostly we get asked for CFOs, GMs, chief product or technology officers, because that's often a missing link, So think about that digital director. It might be a sweet spot for us, given we were born of Silicon Valley, though we have people from every industry on the board list. I'd say the things that start to peak and trough, a little spikes, ESG, like people like literally, maybe there is a chief sustainability officer that we would want to put on the board or somebody with a sustainability background. We've seen sort of minor peaks around how do I manage the future of work, a CHRO? But I would say the constant heartbeat are, general managers, CFOs, product and tech. Oh, and of course, marketing, anything that is representing the voice of the customer. Those are pretty enduring trends that we see.
Got it. Very interesting. Would you consider board diversity efforts a bright spot? As we mentioned earlier, ESG is under scrutiny, to put it mildly. Would you say that board diversity is a bright spot in what we're seeing lately?
I would. And the reason is, if you think about, remember we talked about those tailwinds, think about what's happened in recent months, like in the last couple of years, Goldman Sachs, NASDAQ, institutional investors putting their money where their mouth is and saying, we're not going to advise or bank or, have folks, list on our exchange without meeting some diversity requirements, legislation in California. So you have pushes from a lot of areas. So I would say as a result, if you were to look at the data on incoming board directors to, let's say, the Fortune 500, you would find that, I think it's a majority are now diverse. So you can see that as board seats turn over, a disproportionate, which is needed to, by the way, right the balance, a disproportionate might be going to diverse candidates in order to, as I said, have a composition in the boardroom that reflects, our customers, our stakeholders, our employees, and quite frankly, is needed to sort of, as I said, for long-term performance. So I do think it's a bright spot. I don't think the attention is going away from board diversity, which, as I said, a distinct issue in the diversity and inclusion landscape from, as we talked about, CHRO budgets and what are you doing for all of your workforce and to make sure your entire workforce is reflective, of the population at large, of the customers you serve. So I am a little more worried about the latter than the former, but that doesn't mean we take our eye off the ball on board diversity. It just means, now today there's pressure from a lot of areas. And as I said, I don't think there's any retrenchment from that. If anything, I believe boards in times of uncertainty turn over at a faster rate. So interestingly, isn't it ironic that uncertainty might create more board diversity opportunity when you just think about the need to change up your boardroom? So it's the freeing up of seats that allows us to rebalance what our boards look like, right? When seats are tied up for 9-10 years and nobody is moving out of the boardroom, it's very hard to change the balance. But as seats are turning over, the question is, okay, this is your opportunity.
You mentioned earlier that about 75% of the demand on the board list is from private organizations. Can you provide any perspective on the differences you're seeing in the approach from private firms versus publicly traded firms when it comes to adding board members?
Sure. Well, let's talk about some of the bright spots. So if 75% of our demand is from private and a quarter is from public, you can think of the board list as pretty even between, let's call early stage, mid stage, late stage private, which could include unicorns, often does, and public. Okay. So think of us as 25, 25, 25, 25. That's sort of what we look like. Now, what's the difference? Interestingly, I would say in the, and founders, like, until they have an independent seat, which is really your first institutional round of funding, I would say historically, they might not have filled that seat. Now what we see is we have a number of VC partners who are subscribers to the board list, they're part of our subscriber base. And we end up running a lot of education events on how to build a great boardroom. That means board practices, including recruitment, but not exclusively recruitment, right? It's about how do you run a great boardroom? So I would say the appetite for founders at the early end, what I would see is a lot more curiosity on how do you build a great boardroom early. And of course, if you're going to build it early, build diversity into it. It's so much easier, like in your organization, to build it in early, because then as you have a heterogeneous workforce, there's a kind of, I would just say, virtual cycle, right? They have virtuous cycle as they refer employees into other employees into the company. They themselves have heterogeneous networks. And a lot of our, employee bases grow through referral. So, and people already see the workplace as inclusive. And, you can think about the snowball compounding effect of being diverse early. So I think that I'd say observe early on, founders are pretty curious about how to create a great boardroom. And we spend a lot of our education events increasingly not talking to candidates, but talking to companies that are early about what does a great boardroom look like? What are the practices? How does recruitment fit in? How does diversity fit in? As you move sort of mid and late stage, I would say, and you enter worlds where companies are closer to going public, or managed, I'd say majority controlled by private equity, there's a lot of good demand. They know what to do. You see increasingly private equity firms have their own talent partners. They control the board. They really want a diverse perspective. So we see private equity is actually, quite frankly, quite hungry to build a pipeline of diverse candidates and broaden their networks. We'd see later stage VC-backed companies is starting to put in practices, call it 18 to 24 months before IPO, that maybe 24 months at the latest, 18 months is probably the sweet spot where they're like, wow, what does my boardroom need to look like? They set up committees, they already feel the heat. They're like, wow, they already might be adopting some of the practices of a public board, comp or audit. And so they're starting to look to IPO and filling those. Now, we know the IPO window is closed for a lot of tech companies, but overall, they're still getting, I would say, IPO ready in what they need to look like. So I'd say that's how it differs. A lot of early education, I'd say a place where there's already velocity, and our job is just to help accelerate it. And then, of course, public is, under its own bright lights.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you for that. I do want to shift and talk a little bit about the state of venture capital while we have some time. On Monday, the National Bureau of Economic Research published a study co-authored by Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, which said Black founders of U.S. startups raised just 1/3 as much venture capital over the past 5 years as other comparable businesses formed at the same time. Does this finding surprise you?
Unfortunately, it does not. As you know, there is systemic bias in the movement of capital, from everything from who controls the capital, let's go all the way up to the LP and institutional investors who then pass down to private equity funds and VCs. If you think about all of the funders of capital are themselves, relatively speaking, non-diverse. And even though, I certainly was parked at a venture capital firm, A Crew Capital, and I'm a venture advisor there that is founded by women and is 88% diverse. That is the extreme minority of the funding situation. So when you have homogeneous networks controlling all the funds, you do have systemic bias in sort of what their networks look like. And maybe even their understanding of the opportunity for all populations versus populations they recognize. And again, I don't even think it's malintent. When we talk about unconscious bias, it's just about, we know what we know, we don't know what we don't know. And so there is still an extreme lack of diversity, in the controlling of capital. So it is not a surprise to me that when it comes to who gets the capital, that systemic bias shows up. Now you hit another issue, which is difficult. If it's difficult for women, when you have intersectionality, women of color, people of color, this hits, you can get hit twice as hard, right? In that bias. So even if you get the funds, do you get quite the same funds? Do you have to, pitch harder for the same story? Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. So there's a kind of, as you know, a challenge here, which is you need to diversify the capital base and the people who are allowed to invest if you want to get, diverse companies to have sort of, I would say, their fair share of the capital pie.
But how do we ignite that action?
Well, first of all, I think if you're an LP, my God, what are you asking, the people to whom you give money for their accountability on the diversity of their portfolio, on the diversity of the C-suite of their portfolio, the diversity of the pipeline of things you look at? Ask the right questions, demand accountability, apply pressure duly, because it all flows from the funds. If somebody says, well, guess what? Your fund outperformed and that's good enough for me. I'm like, really? Is that good enough for you? You don't actually ask about the opportunities missed. And there's lots of data that talks about how women are more capital efficient, about how diverse founders outperform, teams with diverse founders outperform. The data is there. But if you're not asking the right questions as an LP, you control the capital. So you have to hold the people to whom you're giving capital accountable. What are the metrics you are asking for? That's that's key. Secondly, of course, is when there are emerging managers who are diverse, are you yourselves looking at how you fund diverse managers? As you know, so of all of the people you fund, you have to ask for accountability on their metrics. Then what are you doing to fund capital in your own capital allocation to diverse managers who often think about the double whammy? They're emerging first-time managers, so they already get a haircut on the capital they get from you. What are you doing to change the ratio of funders in the ecosystem? So this is, it's an upstream problem, it's a midstream problem, it's a downstream problem. But if you flow all the way where capital originates, you can't in the public markets talk about how you are ESG supportive And as you make your allocations to, private funds, be them venture capital, be they private equity, be they REITs, whatever, not ask for accountability in the people deploying your alternative asset categories, and to whom you're giving money for alternative asset allocation.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't compute if publicly you're saying one thing in your, especially think about crossover funds, people who are inordinately large pension funds and so on. They have so much power to help change the game.
Mm-hmm. What do you say about our younger colleagues and investors, right, who have a point of view and high expectations of the workplace and wanting to see a more inclusive society, more representative society? Do we need this block of investors to push, for that change, to accelerate it at a more rapid pace? Because from my vantage point, I came across a stat earlier today. PitchBook says that $151 billion were raised by venture capital firms from investors as of September 2022. But going to your point, emerging managers are having a very hard time getting a nice portion of that, those funds. So it's relying on that next generation to just break open the door.
Well, it's interesting, right? I mean, I don't have the stats on emerging fund managers, but I do know the number of emerging fund managers. I don't have the stats, but anecdotally, the number of emerging fund managers who are diverse and look to either allocate capital to diverse founders or just allocate capital by its very nature. They will end up, allocating it in a more diverse way. I think they're showing up to your point. I think institutional investors have got to be very cognizant about how much of their capital they will allocate to diverse managers and how they will fund. It's not in the first fund, it's in the second, third, fourth funds. How if you want to start somebody with a, $10 million allocation, that's okay. But you have to be there for funds 2, 3, 4, 5, so they can build their capital base once they have a track record. And quite frankly, it does require you to take a little bit of risk on people who's, maybe are crossing over from being an operator to a venture fund. So to answer your question, I do think I see a lot of young investors actually who are solo GPs. You see, in the world I live in, you see angel investors who then go out and raise solo GP funds. So there's a lot of new investors at the table. The balance is obviously, which is the balance that any LP needs to strike, is the balance between, hey, I want a track record of performance. That's fair, right? That's fair. But you also have to invest in the high potentials. Otherwise, it's just like the boardroom. If you say, I only want a sitting CEO, that in and of itself is going to narrow the pool available for people who are board ready, but don't have the CEO title through systemic bias. It's the same thing. If you say, I'm only going to fund investors who have a, ridiculously, impressive track record, you're leaving, you're casting your net too narrow in building a portfolio of diverse managers and taking a little bit of risk on people, quite frankly, not a lot, on people whose track record may be smaller or earlier, but quite frankly have maybe as much, if not more, potential to outperform. Sorry, this is what happens when you're at home.
Oh, all good. No, thank you. You mentioned earlier that you serve as a venture advisor to Accrue Capital and their Diversified Capital Fund. And you mentioned it earlier, but I just want to stress again the role of intentionality when it comes to supporting underrepresented leaders and founders.
Sure. Yeah. Let me talk a little bit about what the Accrue Diversified Capital Fund does. So I said, as you note, I'm a venture advisor. What that really means is in between StubHub and taking on the Xero role, I parked myself at a venture firm that I am very close to called Accrue Capital, founded by Lauren Kolotny and Teresa Gao, two well-known VCs, but who set up shop on their own. And they had already built a team that, quite frankly, was 88% diverse in terms of the investor base. So they were up and running and going. And when I came out of StubHub, one of the conversations I had with Teresa was, as I was working on things related to the board list, ironically, it had nothing to do with Accrue. But Teresa and I were chatting. I was like, I'm at the board list and I see all of, we have this 22,000 candidate database and everybody's asking them to be on boards. That's awesome. How come no one is asking them to be an LP as individuals? How come nobody is asking, all these incredible leaders to join their cap table? Because I know the wealth I've created for myself through being an angel investor and being invited to have a seat at the investor table. So now we're not talking about LPs. We're talking about who are institutions. We're talking about the opposite side of LPs, which is angel investing. And I'm like, it's really irritating to me. Like, don't these people deserve all the opportunities? Shouldn't they be investors too? Because we know that if somebody creates wealth, they then go and in turn, fund the next ecosystem of investors. So if we're going to put money in the hands of diverse fund managers, why are we not trying to generate wealth for, diverse executives who are angel investors? Because they will pour back into the ecosystem. And so this is what we call diversifying the cap table. And Teresa's like, you're absolutely right. So, Sukhinder, why don't you come work on that with us? And what we ultimately kind of originated at ACREW was the thesis of what we called the Diversified Capital Fund. It's a $300 million fund we raised in early 2021. So now almost 2 years. And it's alongside ACREW's early stage vehicle, which is a $400 million fund. But the growth fund is specifically designed to do two things. Number one, in addition to taking money from institutional investors, both diverse and non-diverse, we invited hundreds of diverse leaders in Silicon Valley to become LPs in our fund, which is kind of virtually unheard of. And we have several hundred who are on the cap table of our fund, which we call the Diversified Capital Fund. So that's half the equation. Then when we go to deploy those funds, we don't deploy them in just companies run by diverse founders. We want to deploy them, it's a growth fund, in the best performing companies. But we go to those founders and say, okay, I don't know, Gusto, which is one of our investments, or, there are many others, but we say, Gusto, you're raising your next round and it's $100 million round. And 90% of that money from your lead investors and so on is undiverse. Why don't you take a check from ACREW? We have aggregated for you a group of diverse LPs. So when we come onto your cap table, we are not just there as great investors who know our stuff, but for a $5 or $10 million allocation in your large round, we are bringing along with us diverse investors on our cap table, which means you're diversifying who generates wealth as you build your company. So, and with most founders, that resonates. The issue is not that they don't want to have diversity on their cap table. It's a lot of work. If you're managing a $100 million round, guess what? The chances you're going to go out and find 50 angels, to come on your cap table to do the right thing. So we want to make it easy for them to be inclusive in who generates wealth, who gets to invest in their companies. So that's what the Diversified Capital Fund does. We're really pleased with the reception it's met in the market. It's definitely a pioneering concept of aggregating and bringing diversity to the table, not just for board memberships, but literally for the opportunity to be LPs. And I think most of the executives in our network who joined us as LPs, for many of them, it was the first time they've ever been invited to invest in a fund. And these are exceptional leaders. For most of them, for a good portion of them, we had to teach them. Because if you've never invested in a private equity vehicle, in a venture vehicle, you don't know, what is carry? What is, what are all these things? What are the risks? What's the return profile? But, if they're going to build an alternative asset portfolio, we did a lot of educating because they've never been asked. And that's a shame. That's really a shame. Mm-hmm. They should be. Yeah. So that's what we do. That's what we do with this particular fund.
Oh my gosh, I have thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you. We must leave it there. Thanks so much, Sukhinder, for joining us today and providing just such valuable insight to our audience. Barbara, over to you.
Thank you. And Sukhinder, I have to second what Shartia just said. That was just superb. Thank you so much. And we hope you'll come back and join us after you've got some time in the saddle there. We're excited about that. And Shartia, always great interview. Thanks. I just want to mention in terms of upcoming events, we have our year-end dinner, which will be with the Honorable Joe Manchin, U.S. Senator. We're listed on our website where you can register. We're going to be, and you can see there, he's going to be interviewed by Steve Clemons. We're excited about that event later this week. Also, just keep tracking with our website. We're going to be soon releasing our 2023 events, and we have been confirming already, so they'll be going up soon. And just a moment, I'd like to take to thank our members of the Centennial Society. We now have 357 strong in terms of members that have joined Centennial, and we thank them for their contributions, which provide the financial backbone for the club and enable us to provide our programming now and well into the future. If you'd like to become a member, just let us know, and we can follow up with you. And again, thank you everyone for attending today. We look forward to seeing you soon, and have a great rest of the week.